Hi, my name's Anna Perry, and I once was like you who didn't watch Cameron's videos. Don't be like me and watch his videos. Did you hear me the first time?
Hear you do what?
You should have heard me in front of the whole church.
I don't even want to hear it.
Okay, are you ready?
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. If you haven't started watching the videos yet, it's not too late. Hope you enjoy this one.
If you want to be a part of the next video, text Cameron and don't forget to click subscribe.
Woo! Hey guys, okay, so last devotion we looked at Psalm 23 and this thought of God will not remove us from the darkness, but God will walk with us through the darkness, and by God's presence, the darkness will have no power over us. Today we're going to look at another passage that talks about darkness and light and continue kind of in our Lenten theme. And I think living in the midst of this crisis, we assume that our darkness maybe is COVID-19. And in part, maybe it is. But let's kind of take that out of the picture for a moment. Let's say this was a normal fourth week in the season of Lent, and we were thinking through darkness as being maybe all that is the opposite of Christ. Maybe even a part of our initial Lenten journey was an attempt to be more like the light of Christ in this world, and we were trying to find ways to get rid of all that isn't an example of the light of Christ. So let's take a quick look at Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 14, and let's see what it says about darkness and light. I'll read that for you. For once you were in darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what such people do secretly, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, sleeper awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. So clearly here there is a difference between light and darkness, and there's so much more language in Scripture in general about both light and bearing fruit, and we see both of that here in Ephesians chapter 5. And I think the summary of this passage is a call to live as children of light. And I think that maybe as believers we try to do that. That's how we try to live. But we must ask ourselves in the midst of any situation, even this current situation, how are we the light of Christ in this moment or in that moment to whoever is around us. Breaking things down, we get kind of some examples of how we are to live as children of the light. Verse 10 tells us, first, try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. And we know what's pleasing to the Lord, right? It's anything that aligns with Christ, anything that will make us an imitator of God. Backing up just a bit, we read that it's anything that is good and right and true. So, looking into Scripture, what might that be? It's being faithful, even being surrounded by critics and non-believers. It's being prayerful. Jesus prayed often for his friends and his enemies and even help during trials. It's looking to godly wisdom for examples. We are blessed to have the Gospels for a better understanding of what Jesus did, but even Jesus himself used part of what we now call the Old Testament to rebuke and to teach. It's being virtuous, choosing carefully what consumes our mind and our body and our spirit. It's being humble, obedient, patient, forgiving, charitable, and most of all, loving. Verse 11 says that once we find these things out, we must take no part in darkness. We must really do only those things. And that's really the hardest part, right? That's why Lent can be so meaningful for us as we try to shed that darkness into being more and more of an example of the light. But sometimes we're like the prodigal son and we choose darkness without really even seeing it as it happens. Sometimes we choose darkness even when we try to resist doing that very thing. Sometimes we choose darkness just because it's more fun, it's more convenient, or maybe it's the socially acceptable thing to do. Verse 12 says that we should even be careful about what we do in secret. And then I love how verse 11 ends. It's a big challenge. It says, then expose the works of darkness. So not only should we refrain from those things, but we should also expose it. And what a challenge is that for us. for us to kind of live in the light of Christ, and then when we find these things that do not point to the light of Christ, to not only refrain from doing those things, but to expose those things. And so I think Ephesians 5 verses 8 through 14 does present a big challenge for us. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord, to take no part in darkness, to expose the works of darkness, and even be careful about what we do in secret. I pray that in the midst of this crisis, we do not forget that God is willing to walk with us through our darkest days. I pray that in the midst of this crisis, we do not forget that God has called us out of darkness and into marvelous light, to live as children of light, even now, if not now, more than ever, to hold to our Lenten commitments, to take no part in darkness, to expose it, while we find and do what is pleasing to God, and to continue to differentiate between what is light and what is darkness. This passage ends with this. It says, "Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Today I leave you with that same thought. Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.